It's time for another Dirt Daily, and today I'm going to tell you about one of my favorite trucks. One of the trucks that when I first saw it, I hated it, and now I'm kind of attached to it. But before I do that, this episode is brought to you by onX Off-Road. onX Off-Road is a mapping app. You can put it on your phone. It helps you find off-road trails. If you're in a place you've never been before and you want to do some four-wheeling, you can load up the onX Off-Road app and it helps you find trails around there. Or if you've been in a place where you've been before and you're on a trail and you're not really sure how to get off of the trail or how the trail goes through the wilderness, you can also open up the app and find your way home if you're doing some four-wheeling. Or if you want to plan a big adventure and you're trying to find trails that you can hit while you're on a road trip or whatever like that. Check it out, onX Off-Road. I use the app all the time. And it's funny because my brother, who's not really an off-road guy, he also has the app and he uses it a lot. He does some agriculture stuff. So it's one of those apps that's really useful. And when you first get it, you might be like, how much am I really going to use this? But then you start finding all types of applications that might be unusual for what you would normally look for with an off-road mapping app. In fact, one of the higher settings allows you to find landowners. And I've used that a bunch where I've either looked into properties to see if they were available, if they're available for off-roading. Maybe I saw a truck sitting in a field. I was able to track down the owner of the property and see if it was ever for sale. But that's not what we're talking about today. We're not talking about an old truck that's been abandoned out in the backyard. We're talking about a truck that is pretty epic, and it's one of my favorite trucks, and I probably should really drag the thing to the junkyard. This is my 2003 Chevy Avalanche. And this is a truck that I did not want to have anything to do with. This truck actually came about when I was in my first year at a magazine called Peterson's Four-Wheel and Off-Road Magazine. I was working at this magazine for a guy named Rick Payway, which if any of you are into off-roading or into Jeeps, you have probably heard the name Rick Payway. And at the time, I was a feature editor. I worked at Four-Wheel and Off-Road Magazine with two other guys, Jared Jones and David Kennedy. And if you don't know who those guys are, they went on to illustrious careers. David actually ran Diesel Power Magazine for a while. Now he works with the NHRA, and my buddy Jared Jones now runs an event called Fullsize Invasion. So if you've ever seen that, or if you want to do some full-size four-wheeling, then you might want to check out Fullsize Invasion. Jared does events all over the place, and I've never actually been on a full-size invasion, even though I have a full-size. It would be perfect for an invasion. This one in particular needs a bit of love, but it has a pretty interesting story. So the Chevy Avalanche was introduced in about 2001. It was actually kind of a weird offering. It was basically a pickup truck that was built on the same platform as the Suburban. And in 2001, they actually brought them out. The first model year was actually probably 2002, but I think they got to dealers in late 2001. And they were originally introduced as a half-ton, which gave them all the underpinnings of the half-ton Suburban. It had like a 5-link coil rear suspension, had a 5.3-liter V8, and then in about late 2002, early 2003, they brought out the 3/4 ton. And to me, the 3/4 ton is the cool one. The 3/4 ton has an 8.1-liter big block underneath the hood. It has about 340 horse, maybe 450 pound-feet of torque. Had a 4L80 transmission, leaf springs in the rear, and a giant corporate 14 bolt. It had all of the cool parts if you were going to build an off-road truck. But it was ugly. It came with this plastic cladding that ran down the sides. And I remember when I first saw them, I was like, this thing is gross. Why would anybody want this? You could just buy a 3/4 ton pickup truck. In fact, when I was working at Four-Wheel and Off-Road Magazine, and Rick Payway brought us all into his office to have a staff meeting, and he said, for Ultimate Adventure 2003, we are going to build an Avalanche. And I remember being like, that's the dumbest thing ever. I was young, I was green, I didn't really know all of the things that you could do with an Avalanche, but I was also a Jeep guy and a Toyota guy, and I was like, why would you want a big dumb truck like that? They're ugly. They have all this cladding. They're huge. It's just going to get smashed up on the trail, which a lot of that became true. But I remember I was the one that spoke up and said, this is a terrible idea. And Rick turned to me and said, guess what? This is your project. So this truck became my project because I didn't know enough to keep my mouth shut. Instead, I blurted out my opinion about the ugly Avalanche. And the next thing you know, I had to build it. So the Avalanche had this body cladding, but it only had it up until about 2003. Unfortunately, they never made the Avalanche without body cladding with the 3/4 ton drivetrain. As far as I know, I've never seen one. I've always looked for one. The Avalanche without the plastic body cladding looks pretty cool, or it looks better at least. The Avalanche with the body cladding looks like this weird kid's toy that turned into a truck thing. I don't really know why they put the body cladding on it. I guess that was kind of the trend. Grand Cherokees had stuff like that, but I don't really get why they did it to the Avalanche. It kind of ruined it as far as I was concerned, which is part of the reason why I spoke up and was like, we don't want to build one of those, which I would eventually regret having said, but then at the end of the day, the Avalanche ended up in my backyard. So around 04, all the Avalanches got Hydro Boost brakes, which is where the power steering pump makes boost for your brakes instead of a vacuum booster. All the 3/4 tons had that, but then in about 04, they added that to the half tons as well, the 1500s. And then in about 06, they stopped the 3/4 ton model completely. So it was really only available for about 3 or 4 years. This 8.1 liter big block truck thing that was based off a Suburban, but it had beefier parts under it, like that 14 bolt, which ironically, when we built the ultimate Avalanche, I didn't know enough to keep the 14 bolt. I thought it would be a better idea to get rid of the 14 bolt and put in a low pinion Dana 60 with rear steer in the back of this truck when we originally built it, because we were working with a company called Dynatrac back then. And so my idea was, this truck is big and long, I'll put rear steer under it and that'll help it go up the trail better, which in hindsight probably wasn't the best idea, because a 14 bolt would have worked just fine and it wouldn't have added the complexity of the rear steer, but we'll get to that down the road on this story. So in around 07, the Avalanche was discontinued as this body style and it went to the second generation, but that was available with both the 5.3 liter V8 and a 6 liter engine. And then the 6 liter stuck around until about 2010. And then in about 2013, they canceled the Avalanche completely, which I don't really think anybody missed it when it went away. There's like a small contingent of Avalanche owners that are big fans of the Chevy Avalanche, but for the most part, I think it went away and nobody really shed a tear. There was another vehicle that was based off of the Avalanche, which is actually probably a better vehicle all around, because this was the Cadillac Escalade EXT. So it's basically a Cadillac version of the Avalanche. It had the half-ton underpinning, so it had the 5-link coil rear suspension, but instead of the 5.3 or the 6 liter, it had a 6.2 liter, which put out about 400 horsepower, 417 pound-feet of torque. So it was a really cool engine. If I was to start over, I would probably track down a Cadillac EXT and then just put a 14 bolt under the rear, and you'd probably have a much beefier off-road truck than the 3/4 ton. Maybe the 3/4 ton chassis is probably a little bit tougher, but I think having the 6.2 is a better power to weight ratio than the 8.1. Unless you want torque. The 8.1 has way more torque than all of those small blocks. So, what happened after I spoke up and told everybody we don't want to build an Avalanche, and Rick was like, guess what? That's your project. So the way a lot of the Ultimate Adventure builds would work back in the early 2000s was the publishing company would get an OEM to be a sponsor. And in 2003, the sales guys at 4 Wheel and Off-Road Magazine and at our publishing company went to Chevrolet and were like, hey, why don't you sponsor this event we put on every year called Ultimate Adventure? And Chevrolet was like, sure, we'll sign up for that, but you guys should build a Chevy Avalanche. And so it was kind of a money grab. Like, these sales guys were trying to get the money to come in from Chevrolet, and we were then tasked with building this. And I was like, why are we building this thing? It's so big and dumb and ugly. And luckily, I had David Kennedy on my side, because David Kennedy was a really smart guy. And I was a die-hard off-road guy, but David was really smart, and he knew about the 3/4 ton Avalanche, which it wasn't even on my radar. Because why would it be? This thing was big and ugly, and like I was into Jeeps and Toyotas and rock crawlers and buggies and all the stuff that really like looked badass going off-road. The Avalanche, not even on the radar. But David was like, if we have to build an Avalanche, we should build a 3/4 ton Avalanche, because it has the 8.1 liter, 4L85 transmission, 14 bolt rear axle, 3/4 ton, so it's beefier, leaf springs in the back, pretty robust and easy to modify. And we went on a little expedition. So here's how it was kind of weird. Chevy was sponsoring Ultimate Adventure, and Chevy was paying us to be a title sponsor, and they wanted us to build an Avalanche. But they were not able to just get us an Avalanche. It didn't really work that way. They were like, well, we want you to do this, but in order to get an Avalanche to you through marketing and PR and whatever advertising funds they would have to do was going to be jumping through a lot of hoops and bureaucracy. So what they did was they basically said, go buy an Avalanche and then bill it to us and we'll pay you back. Which in hindsight is kind of wacky, but that was cool. So David came to me and was like, there's a Chevy dealership downtown Los Angeles, down in southern LA area, and they have a 3/4 ton Avalanche there. Let's go check it out. So we get in a truck and we drive down there and we show up, and we were driving a truck to the Chevy dealership that some of you may recall. It was the Ultimate Super Duty. It was a truck we had built prior Ultimate Adventure, and it was all beat up, and we roll into this Chevy dealership with this massive Ford Super Duty that's all smashed up, and two guys hop out, young guys, probably in our 20s, 30s. So we roll up in this big beat up Ford F-250 that's all smashed in and on giant mud tires, and start looking for this Avalanche, and nobody at the car dealership would deal with us. Like, nobody would come talk to us. And I mean, get it. Here's a couple young guys in a beat up old truck walking in. They're looking at us like we probably shouldn't even be there. And then this young kid comes up to us and says, hey, can we help you? And Dave's like, we want to buy this Chevy 3/4 ton Avalanche. It says it's on your dealer lot, and it says it's bright red. So he's like, all right, hop in the golf cart. So we get in the golf cart and we drive around the dealer. We drive all over this dealership, and we can't find the truck anywhere, which is weird because like we had seen it online. It was on their website. It should have been there. And this kid who's a sales guy, he couldn't find it. And none of the other like older sales guys were willing to help us at all. So we drive around, we look at a whole bunch of stuff, but there's no 3/4 ton Avalanche. And then he's like, let me go back to the main office and see if we can find out where it's parked. Go back to the main office, we're hanging out, and he walks out and he's like, it's actually right on the showroom floor. So we walk over, and there on the showroom floor is this bright red Chevy Avalanche, 3/4 ton. And it was sitting there right in the center of the showroom. But they weren't really having an easy time selling it. Maybe the price of fuel was high. Maybe nobody really wanted a 3/4 ton anymore. Maybe it was just that it was this funky Avalanche with all this weird body cladding. Whatever it was, nobody was kicking in their doors to buy this truck. And Dave and I look it over, and we know what we need to do. We need to buy this thing, but we also know that we don't want to pay like sticker. So the guy's like, what do you think? And we're like, well, give us a good deal and we'll buy the Avalanche. And he's like, okay. And he leaves, and he comes back, and he's like, what type of deal are you guys looking for? And we are like, you know, give us a good deal. We're going to make an agreement to buy this thing. You're going to deliver it to us at our office, and then we will have a check there at the office that we'll give you. And the guy's like, okay. And he leaves, and he comes back, and he's like, can you guys buy this tonight and not tomorrow at your office? And we were like, well, we don't have a check with us to buy this. We don't have the cash on us to buy this truck. But I mean, like, we'll agree to buy it. And he's like, well, we don't want you guys to leave without buying the truck. So if you could fill out some paperwork that says you'll buy it, then you guys can take the truck home tonight. This is nuts to me. Like, at the time, young guy, had never bought a brand new truck before in my life. Had only bought cheap junk, 4x4s, used stuff. This dealership was basically going to hand us the keys to this. And so the guy leaves to get the paperwork, and David looks at me and he goes, I really hope that guy doesn't run my credit. And I said, I don't really have credit. Like, we really shouldn't be getting this truck. Like, we were sure they were going to kick us out. They came back, handed us papers, we signed papers, and they handed us the keys. Which is nuts. They just handed us the keys to drive away in this Chevy Avalanche. I don't know if dealerships do that anymore. I'm pretty sure they do a little bit more background check versus just handing two guys the keys to the truck. But the funny part of that story was we get in the truck and we're about to drive it out of the showroom floor. And David Kennedy opens the door and he looks inside and he says, there's no floor mats. And the guys scatter. By now it's like 9 o'clock at night. All these sales guys want to go home. The young kid who nobody believed in talked to the two guys that nobody wanted to deal with and ended up selling the bright red 3/4 ton Avalanche off the showroom floor that nobody was able to sell. And then we just about canceled the deal because there were no floor mats. So all these sales guys run around, they come back with floor mats, and the floor mats are still in the truck today. But it was just ridiculous. We got in this thing and we left the dealership, and David and I stopped for dinner and we were like, I can't believe they gave us the keys to this thing. We drove home in the giant F-250 and the brand new 3/4 ton Avalanche, and before you know it, it got destroyed. And that was just in the buildup of the thing. Like, it would take a couple more months and then we would eventually get this thing on the trail where it would get destroyed again. Now, I say it got destroyed in the buildup, but that's not really true. It got modified a lot in the buildup. See, we wanted to take this truck on Ultimate Adventure. And on Ultimate Adventure, you need to have certain things. You need to have big tires, you need to have roll cage, a winch, and we decided that we weren't going to keep the independent front suspension that was under the 3/4 ton Avalanche. We were going to cut all that out and put in a solid axle. And the place to do that back then in the early 2000s in Southern California was a place called Off-Road Unlimited. Off-Road Unlimited was in Burbank, California, and we spoke to those guys and they were like, yeah, bring it in. We want to do this project. So I was now in charge. I had this project vehicle. I'd never taken on a project this big for the magazine before, and I was handed the keys to this 3/4 ton Avalanche and went to Off-Road Unlimited to get a plan. So I took it over there, and the plan was pretty nuts. We were going to take both axles, the independent front suspension out, throw that away, the 14 bolt out, give that away. In fact, I think David Kennedy took that for one of his projects. And then we were going to replace the transfer case and put Dynatrac axles under the thing, put an Atlas in it, put all new suspension under it, put a roll cage in it, and turn it into a truck that we could take to lead Ultimate Adventure. And this was kind of the MO for Off-Road Unlimited. They had a kit where they could put leaf springs under the front of a Chevy truck, cut all the IFS out, and put a Dana 60 under there. Now, in hindsight, I wish I would have kept the 14 bolt, but I really wanted to do this wacky rear steer setup to allow the axle to steer and to kind of drive this giant truck up and down the trail. Knowing what I know now, I would have just kept the 14 bolt. In fact, now the truck has a 14 bolt from that same era back under it because I broke the ring and pinion in the low pinion Dana 60 too many times. But that's because this truck ended up really big and heavy. We built the truck at Off-Road Unlimited, and then we took it up to a place in Santa Rosa to get it painted. And while it was in Santa Rosa, I took it to another shop to have the roll cage put in. Oh, and before I took it to Santa Rosa to get painted, I drove it all the way to Colorado to have rock sliders and a rear bumper put on by Poison Spider Customs, which was back then just getting started. Now, the crazy thing is that I didn't tow this truck anywhere because the magazine didn't have a tow rig or a trailer. So I would just get in the project truck. We would work on it at one shop, Off-Road Unlimited, for a couple months. And then once we got it dialed in and running and driving, then I would get in and drive it to Colorado, where we do the rock sliders and the rear bumper. And then I'd get in it and drive it to another shop in Santa Rosa, California, for the paint and the roll cage. And it's just funny to me now, because nowadays I was like, well, just put it on the trailer and tow it so that you're not putting miles on it, so you're not wearing it out. But we didn't have that option at the time, and so I just drove the thing everywhere. And another thing we did was, when we put the rear steer in the Avalanche, we had to remove one of the gas tanks. So this behind me is the small gas tank that goes under the bed of the Avalanche. And my original idea was to bob the back of the Avalanche and do rear steer, so it'd be shorter, but it was more nimble. Bobbing the bed of this was not really a good idea, because the back of the Avalanche has these toolboxes, so it just has a lot of stuff going on inside here. So we ended up scrapping the whole bob the bed idea. But I did keep the rear steer idea, and that had like this hydraulic control module that would run the rear steer, and that needed a place to live. So we pulled out this rear fuel tank and put the hydraulic rear steer control pump underneath the bed, which caused more problems down the road, because one, the truck would run out of fuel. It had something funky going on where it would run out of fuel because it wasn't seeing this tank. So it had a bunch of check engine lights on, and then the fuel gauge was off, and then I'd run out of fuel. Like, I ran out of fuel, I think 3 or 4 times in it before I kind of figured out how many miles I could actually get on the tank. 2, eventually down the road, years and years later, when I actually bought this thing from the magazine, I couldn't smog it because it's missing half of the fuel system. And I eventually got another fuel tank to put under there, but never got around to it, partially because the suspensions had changed over time, and it was still not easy to fit the stock tank back in. So we ran around a bunch getting this truck built. It has a roll cage, has solid axle under the front, rear steer Dana 60 under the rear, Atlas transfer case, brand new drive shafts, brand new body armor, all of this work done to it. And then it was time to actually go on Ultimate Adventure. And on Ultimate Adventure that original year, it was starting back in, I believe, Tennessee or Alabama. It's back on the East Coast. And we were sponsored by a company called B.F. Goodrich. And B.F. Goodrich had a brand new tire out called the Crawler. It had only been out a year or two, and they had just come out with a 39-inch Crawler. And I was like, we need that tire to put on the Avalanche. So we reached out to BFG, official tire of Ultimate Adventure, 2003, and they sent us a set of these BFG crawlers, and we put it on the truck, and we headed to Alabama. And there's a guy who worked for BF Goodrich. His name was Gary Enterline, and he was the father of the crawler. He had helped develop it. He was one of the engineers. He would go to all the rock crawling competitions. He had kind of worked with rock crawlers and these off-road racers to develop this tire that would work really good off-road. And to this day, it's one of my favorite tires. I'm kind of a fanboy because when I first built this, that was the tire, and Gary's always been a good guy, but also I just really like that tire. It works really good off-road. So, funny story is, we get to Alabama or Tennessee, wherever it was, starting, and I went up to Gary and I was like, I really like the tires, but we're having an issue with it. And he came and looked at them, and he's like, it's like they're cracking. It wasn't actually a crack. It was like where the tread rubber and the sidewall rubber, where it would meld together, it was kind of making this weird wavy situation. And Gary was like, why is this happening? Like, how many miles have you guys put on this? And we're like, well, we just drove it here. And he's like, you drove it from California? These are competition compound sticky tires, and you drove across America? Once again, 4 Wheel Off-Road Magazine did not have a truck and trailer, and we didn't know any better. I didn't know that we shouldn't be driving these on the road that far. So at the end of the day, it wasn't a problem. The tires looked funky, but they worked great off-road. And the truck would start the Ultimate Adventure with Rick Payway behind the wheel, because that's how it worked. He was the editor of the magazine. He would drive the truck on Ultimate Adventure. I was the feature editor. My job was to make sure the truck kept running, but also run around and take pictures to write the magazine article about Ultimate Adventure. And Rick hammered this truck. The very first day, the first trail, I think we did Teleco, which is no longer open, and Rick ran this thing up that trail, bounced it off a bunch of trees, smashed a bunch of stuff, broke, I think, a body mount, a motor mount, or a drive shaft or something. And I was just like, I was devastated. I had worked so hard on this thing for 2 months, 3 months to get it ready for Ultimate Adventure. And Rick, right off the bat, smashed it into stuff. Oh, and there was also an air compressor mounted in one of the side toolboxes. And that air compressor, when it was turned on, it would overheat the wiring. So at one point, there was almost a fire on board before we got it shut off. And I was crushed. I was like, I worked on this thing so much and it's all destroyed. But looking back on it, Rick was handed the keys to a big truck. He's used to driving a Jeep. He was supposed to be the first or second guy up the trail. He's usually right behind a trail guide, so he's usually the first guy. He hasn't run these obstacles before, and the fact that he even got the truck up through the trail was kind of amazing. I remember spending the first night of Ultimate Adventure underneath this thing, wrenching on it until dawn to get it back up and running to run the rest of the week. But it was a lot of fun, and it was my first Ultimate Adventure, my first project truck, and we beat the tar out of it. It was a lot of fun, and and the other problem is it was way too heavy. Like, I brought so much extra stuff. I had tools, parts, all types of extra stuff, thinking that, well, we might need it, which we did kind of need it, but we were also way overweight. I think this truck probably weighed 8,000 or 9,000 pounds running up the trail, way heavier than it probably should have been for that type of adventure. So after Ultimate Adventure 2003, Rick flew home, and I had the Avalanche on the East Coast, and I decided I would drive it back to California. I actually drove from Alabama or wherever we ended up, all the way up to Pennsylvania, and then I think up to Massachusetts even. I went and saw my brother, there was a wedding, and then I drove back across America. And on my trip back across America, I was having this weird vibration. It turns out the mounting bolts for the adapter from the Atlas transfer case to the 4L80 had worked loose, and then at one point as I was driving across Iowa, the Atlas transfer case actually fell off the back of the transmission. If you can imagine a bomb going off under a truck doing 80 miles an hour down a highway in Iowa in the middle of the night, then that is pretty much what happened. There was this explosion, and this whole Avalanche limped to the side of the road, and I got out, got underneath, and I was like, oh my goodness, this thing has been destroyed. I remember calling Rick Payway, and at this point, I hadn't even been at the magazine for a year. And I remember calling Rick and telling him what happened, and he just started laughing. He wasn't like, you're fired. He wasn't like, you're an idiot. He just laughed at me because he was like, yeah, that'll happen. So I hung out in this small town in Iowa, Adair, Iowa, and hung out in this town for probably 3 days before I was able to get a ride to Omaha and get a flight home. And then eventually we got the Avalanche towed all the way back to California. I got a new transfer case put in it, and at some point down the road, this thing came up for sale. But before that, this was my daily driver. I would drive this to work every day, back and forth to work. And then one year, it was a year or two later, we were going on Ultimate Adventure, and the publisher of the magazine, this guy named Jeff Nassy, he wanted to go. And so he commandeered this, and it bummed me out because I was like, oh no, someone else is gonna drive it and smash it. And sure enough, Jeff drove it and smashed it. But it came back to me eventually, and I was able to do a bunch of work to it. And then kind of started the second and third and fourth phases of the Avalanche. The Avalanche went from this bright red truck with scallops on the front and 39-inch crawlers to various different size tires, different colored doors, because the doors kept getting smashed every time somebody would take it off-road, so we'd get different doors. And then at one point, I was like, I just want it to be one color. And I took it to a shop and they painted the whole thing matte black. And I was like, it's not as cool and bright and lively, but it gave it a whole new lease on life. So I was stoked to have the Avalanche back. And then the Avalanche kind of bounced around. I would take it to different shops thinking we would get some work done to it, and then things would fall through or wouldn't have things changed. Eventually it went back to Fab Works in Santa Rosa, California. These are the guys that originally built the roll cage in it, and they were now doing solid axle conversions on trucks as well. And they had a new 5-link front suspension. So we changed the whole front suspension. It has upper and lower links and then a track bar. So 5 links total. We put King coilovers on it with internal bypass shocks, and the whole truck had a brand new lease on life. And also around this time, I had smartened up enough to the fact that the Dana 60 was a bad idea, especially the one in the rear. The one in the front has been great from the start. High pinion, Pro Rock Dana 60, never had an issue. The low pinion in the back of such a heavy truck was just not big enough. So we scrapped the whole rear steer idea and went to a corporate 14 bolt. And around this time, we took the truck to Randy Ellis Design in Arizona, and we did Deaver springs, spring under with King shocks, bypass shocks, and the truck was starting to come back into being something that was going to be cool again. I still had this issue. Oh, the other thing is that somewhere in all of this timeline, I bought it. It came up for sale, and it was probably before it was really well cleaned up, because I was able to get it for a pretty good deal because it was pretty smashed up, and nobody else on staff really wanted it, and I was attached to it emotionally because it was my first project truck at the magazine. That was probably my first mistake. I never probably should have bought this, but I did, and then it turned into this cooler truck. It had Deaver spring under springs in the rear with a 14 bolt and bypass shocks. It had a link suspension up front with coilovers, internal bypass shocks, and overall it was just like better. Oh, and also, when we were at Fab Works doing the front link suspension, we put a whole new front bumper on that kind of gave it a more nimble desert racy look. I had this idea in my head that it was going to change from being a trail rock crawler to being more of a desert Baja type truck, but it was still a solid axle, which doesn't really make sense because like most Baja trucks are not a solid front axle. But I had really good shocks, and I decided that this was going to be the new life of the Avalanche. It was going to be kind of good shocks and more of a go fast truck than it currently was as this kind of beat up trail rig. And then I started a TV show. This was Dirt Every Day, and I'd been doing the show for a while, and Dave had come on as my co-host, and I wanted to do something fun with the Avalanche. And there was an event up in Idaho called Winter Havoc, and it was like this off-road snow race. And I had this truck with bypass shocks in the rear, internal bypass shocks in the front, link suspension, Deavers, and I was like, this truck, a big block 8.1, I was like, this truck would be great for a snow race. So we put it on the list of things to do, that we were going to build the Avalanche to go race it in this snow race. Never should have done that. That was another thing on the list of things I never should have done with the Avalanche, because we did take it from matte black and paint it this really cool green color with a bright orange hood, and then we hauled it up to Idaho and ran it through this snow race and destroyed it. Like, this was the start of the end of the Avalanche. I had dreams that this was going to be a cool daily driver, Baja desert truck. We took it up there and raced it once, and it just got hammered. Like, I would drive one lap, then Dave would drive one lap. And I'm not going to point at any fingers at either of us, but we both destroyed that thing. We would get it wedged, and then we would just hammer it more because it had a big block and we thought it was cool. And it was soaking up the whoops part and like the technical like nacho part, but then the tight stuff, we were just getting hammered. We ended up breaking the front sway bar, parts on the front axle, bending the frame, destroying the B pillar on the passenger side so bad that I had to cut the door off on the passenger side. Basically, that was the start of the end. We ruined the Avalanche by racing it in that one race. It was a lot of fun, and all the suspension and the drivetrain worked great. But again, trying to drive a really big truck on a tight trails was not the smartest thing to do. And I was bummed because this Avalanche that I was stoked to have back and was starting to rebuild had gotten destroyed once again by taking it wheeling. And I was like, ugh, and it got pushed in the corner. So after we pushed it in the corner and it sat there for ages, we came up with the idea to do an episode of Dirt Every Day that would be kind of like the swan song, the end of the Avalanche. And this was where we were going to drive it up a trail in Colorado called 21 Road. 21 Road, pretty gnarly rock crawling trail out by Grand Junction. I'd never run it, Dave had never run it, but it was on both of our bucket lists to do. And the Avalanche was beat up and hammered enough that we were like, hey, what's the worst that can happen to it? So we put some new tires on it. We didn't even put a back door in it. And we headed out to Colorado and we headed in on this trail. And it worked so good. Like the torque of the engine, the suspension that was flexing so well, the BFG tires, overall, like the whole thing was just dialed. And we got probably 90% of the way through that trail unscathed. I mean, there was a few little issues here and there, but I don't know that I don't remember winching. I think we just drove the thing and it was big and dumb and awesome. And the Avalanche, once again, was my favorite truck in the world. And then we got to the end of the trail, almost the end of the trail, and the truck stopped running. And we were like, what's going on? So we diagnosed it and we were like, we're not getting fuel. And so we packed up the whole camera crew and everybody and we went back to town. We came in the next day and we like jerry-rigged a fuel system where we had a fuel pump that was mounted on the floor, running through a hole in the floor into the inlet on the fuel tank to run fuel to the engine, and it still wouldn't run. And then we were like, maybe it needs injectors because the thing had been sitting for who knows how long. So we hiked out again and we came in like the second day and we swapped all the injectors in the engine and got it up and running and finished the trail and got it out of there. And ironically, like 2 days after we left, this forest fire moved in and burnt a lot of that trail up, and it burnt right through where the Avalanche had been sitting for 2 or 3 days. So we got lucky. The Avalanche didn't want to die, but it did get us in and out of that trail with a bunch of more work. So now what? Now what do I do with this thing? I have become attached to this truck. Like it's a truck that I have gone through my off-road magazine life and my TV show life with this truck. But a lot of this truck is junk. Mostly the Avalanche parts. Like the body is hammered. Every quarter panel, every door has dents in it. Half of them don't even open. The frame is buckled, and then we repaired it by adding a truss but not actually fixing it, and it's buckled more. Basically, the Avalanche has to go. The Avalanche is going away. But this 8.1 liter big block is still running and driving great. The 4L80 transmission doing awesome. Atlas transfer case, the second one that we had to put in it, No issues with that at all. Rear 14 bolt, front Pro Rock Dana 60 from Dynatrac. All of those parts I think are still solid and still great to use on other projects. It's 2025. I am going to clean up my shop area. I'm going to get rid of some project vehicles. The Avalanche is going to go away, but I'm keeping all the drivetrain to put it in something else. So, upcoming episode, the Avalanche is going to go into the shop and get torn apart so that all of those parts that are still running great, I can still use, and all the parts that are scrap metal are going to go get turned into scrap metal. I know that people are going to be mad that this thing is getting torn apart, but it's time. It's time to clean up the backyard. It's time to clean up my emotional attachment to this vehicle and apply that to something else that I can actually use on the trail again. That big block, nobody puts big blocks in stuff anymore. Everybody's into LS engines and lightweight stuff, which honestly is probably a better idea, but I have it and I like it, and it's the heart of the truck that I love so much. So in an upcoming episode, Avalanche is going to go on the lift and get blown apart so we can see what there is for us to use on something else. That's it for this Star Daily. We'll see you guys next time. Wait, there's more. There's something else that I wanted to talk about. This truck, this Avalanche, is very unusual. It's unusual in a weird way, but there's a few other trucks that are also unusual in this weird way. In fact, I'm gonna go through a list of them. Chevy Avalanche, Cadillac Escalade EXT, Honda Ridgeline, Hummer H2 SUT, the new electric Hummer truck, the new Rivian truck, the new Tesla Cybertruck, the Ford Maverick, the Chevy Silverado electric EV, the Hyundai Santa Cruz, the Lamborghini LM002, the Volkswagen Transporter Crew Cab, and the Subaru Baja. What do all those things have in common? All of those vehicles have no separation between the cab and the bed. I'm not saying that you can access the bed from the cab, which actually you can in the Avalanche. It has a midgate, and a bunch of those do have midgates. But there's no like back of cab, front of bed seam the way a lot of trucks do, where it's like two different, there's like the cab part and then there's the utility truck part. These vehicles that I've listed off there are all one body, which is actually really good for an off-road vehicle. Whether it's unibody or body on frame, having one body structure that runs from the rear bumper to the front bumper ties everything together like a giant exo cage, like a giant roll cage. So one giant unibody body attached, even if it's on a frame or not, makes it a strong vehicle. What do you call those vehicles? What do you call these trucks where all of them, they're not really trucks, they're not SUVs, they're that sort of sport utility truck, mid-gate truck. There's not really a name for them. And a lot of them are coming out on the market nowadays where there's not that separation of cab and bed, which is kind of dumb if you actually use a truck like a truck should be used, because if you're throwing stuff in a truck and you beat up the bed, you can unbolt the bed and put a new bed on it. Or if you want to get rid of the bed and put a utility bed, a toolbox bed, a flat bed, a camper, any of that sort of stuff, you can't really do that as well on these trucks that are kind of all one module, the whole thing. But on the other hand, if you're going to build like a desert race truck out of something and you wanted it really rigid, this is actually an idea that I have to give to David Kennedy, because he told me about this and I think it's brilliant. Like, one of the best trucks to do that with would be the Cadillac Escalade EXT, because all one body from bumper to bumper. Plus, it comes with a 6.2 LS engine, lots of horsepower, coil link suspension, so it'd ride really good, independent front suspension in the front, which you could build into long travel. So even though nobody is looking at those trucks, and probably nobody's looking at Avalanches these days, both of them would make a really good desert truck, and you would have this rigid body on top of a solid frame running from end to end. But more importantly, what would you call that body style of truck thing. This unibody, like one body that runs from bumper to bumper, and it's a pickup truck and it's a cab. That's what I want to read in the comments below. Tell me what you think this thing should be called. Not the Avalanche, but like this style of truck. And that brings up my final comment, Matryoshka dolls. Do you know what a Matryoshka doll is? A Matryoshka doll is these little Russian dolls, and when you open one, inside it is another little doll. And when you open that, another little doll, and another little doll, and another little doll. And I want somebody, one of you smart guys out there with a 3D printer, to print out Matryoshka dolls of all of those trucks that I listed off. So like start with an Avalanche 3/4 ton, and then you open that up, and inside it is the new electric Hummer, and you open that up, and then there's a Rivian, and you open that up, all the way down to a Subaru Baja, which would be the littlest, tiniest truck that doesn't have a separation between cab and bed. All right, that's it for this Dirt Daily. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you guys next time.